She was just a maid, cleaning the house of a broken man who had sworn never to love again. But sometimes the gentlest touch can heal the deepest wounds. What started as simple housework became something neither of them expected. A story of second chances, quiet courage, and love that blooms in the most unexpected places. If you're ready for a tale that will touch your heart, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive into this beautiful story of healing. The train wheezed to a stop like an old man catching his breath, and Clara pressed her palm against the cool window glass, watching dust motes dance in the amber light of late afternoon. Millbrook stretched before her, a town carved from earth and hope, where wooden buildings stood like weathered sentinels against an endless sky. Her fingers found the small locket at her throat, worn smooth by years of anxious touching. Inside, a pressed violet from her mother's garden lay preserved between thin sheets of glass, the only piece of home she'd carried across 3 states and a lifetime of small failures. "End of the line, miss," the conductor called, his voice kind but tired. Clara gathered her single carpet bag and stepped onto the platform, feeling the weight of new beginnings settle around her shoulders like an invisible shawl. The air here tasted different, dry and honest, without the metallic bite of factory smoke that had choked her previous life. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, had been specific in her letter. Sheriff Walker requires household help. Discretion essential. The position suits those comfortable with silence. Silence. Clara understood silence the way others understood spoken language. It had been her companion through long nights of nursing her ailing father, through the gradual dissolution of dreams she'd once painted in watercolor pastels. Silence had taught her that healing often happened in the spaces between words. The boarding house sat at the edge of town like a grandmother's apron, faded but clean. Mrs. Henderson emerged before Clara could knock, her sharp eyes taking measure, with the efficiency of a seamstress fitting fabric. "You're smaller than I expected," she said, though not unkindly. "The sheriff's house is large, emptier than it should be." Clara nodded, understanding more than the words contained. Every house held its ghosts. She'd learned to clean around them without disturbing their rest. "He's particular about his privacy," Mrs. Henderson continued, leading Clara inside. "Lost his wife 2 years back. Hasn't been the same since. Some folks say he's forgotten how to live with anything but duty." The boarding house parlor smelled of lavender soap and accumulated sorrows. Clara set her bag down gently, the way she'd learned to handle fragile things. Her mother had always said broken things required the softest touch to mend properly. "I start tomorrow?" Clara asked. "Dawn. He leaves early for his rounds. Prefers the house attended while he's gone." Mrs. Henderson studied Clara's face with the intensity of someone reading weather patterns. "You've been hurt before." It wasn't a question. Clara's hand moved instinctively to her locket, drawing strength from the violet pressed against her heart. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." The wounded recognize each other. Makes for better healing when both parties understand the terrain. Sheriff. Ethan Walker's house stood at the end of Maple Street, like a period marking the conclusion of an unfinished sentence. 2 stories of white clapboard and green shutters, surrounded by a garden that had forgotten its purpose. Clara approached at first light, her steps careful on the uneven path. The front door key felt warm in her palm, as if it had been waiting. Mrs. Henderson had warned her about the silence inside, how it pressed against the walls like held breath. But Clara had learned that every silence had its own texture, its own story to tell. She turned the key and stepped into a world suspended between past and present. The foyer smelled of leather and old newspapers, with an undertone of something sweeter. Roses, perhaps, though none bloomed now. Dust particles floated in the morning light that slanted through tall windows, creating patterns that reminded Clara of snow falling in reverse. In the front parlor, a woman's presence lingered like perfume in fabric. Framed photographs lined the mantel, their faces turned slightly away, as if to grant the viewer privacy in their grief. Clara didn't look directly at them. She'd learned that some sorrows required peripheral vision, approached sidewise like wounded animals. The kitchen held more ghosts. 2 coffee cups sat in the sink, though only one showed signs of recent use. A woman's apron hung on a peg by the stove. Its blue gingham faded to the color of forget-me-nots. Clara touched it gently, reading the story written in its careful mending. A small tear above the pocket stitched with love and intention. She began her work with deliberate quiet, moving through rooms that breathed with held memories. The study law book stood at attention on dark shelves, but a romance novel lay spine down on the desk, its pages yellowed at the edges. Clara closed it carefully, marking the place with a feather she found caught in the curtain. Upstairs, the master bedroom remained locked, but Clara could feel its weight pressing down through the floorboards. The guest room held only essentials: narrow bed, a washstand, clothes that smelled of loneliness and duty. She changed the sheets with the reverence of someone tending an altar. By afternoon, the house had begun to remember how to breathe. Clara had opened windows, allowing conversations between inside and outside air. She'd swept and dusted without, disturbing the careful arrangement of grief, understanding that some things needed to remain exactly where sorrow had placed them. She was polishing the brass door knocker when she heard boots on the front steps. Heavy, measured, the walk of a man carrying invisible burdens. Clara stepped aside as the key turned, watching through the sidelight as Sheriff Walker paused in his own doorway. He was taller than she'd expected, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face held the kind of stillness that came from practicing composure until it became a second skin. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Sheriff." Clara kept her tone soft, the way she'd speak to a horse that might spook. "I've finished for today. I'll return tomorrow morning if that suits." He nodded once, his gaze moving past her to catalogue changes in his environment. She saw him notice the open windows, the way light now moved freely through rooms that had been holding their breath. "Mrs. Henderson said you prefer quiet work," he said. "Yes, sir. Houses tell their own stories. I try not to interrupt." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He stepped aside to let her pass, and Clara caught the scent of sage and saddle leather, of a man who spent his days under open sky. "Same time tomorrow," he said. Clara nodded and walked away, feeling his gaze follow her down the garden path, like a question he wasn't ready to ask. 3 weeks passed in careful choreography. Clara arrived each morning as the sheriff's boots echoed down the front steps, and departed before his return cast long shadows across the threshold. They existed, in the spaces between each other's presence, connected by the small improvements she left behind like breadcrumbs, marking her passage. She discovered his preferences through observation: coffee strong enough to wake the dead, shirts pressed with military precision, books returned to their exact positions after reading. He favored the left side of the sofa in the evening. She could tell by the wear pattern in the cushion and the way lamplight fell across that corner. In return, he began to notice her work, not directly, but in the way his movements changed. He no longer walked through the house like a man trying not to disturb ghosts. Windows stayed open after she'd aired them. The newspaper appeared folded on the kitchen table each morning, alongside a clean coffee cup. Clara developed her own rhythms within his space. She sang while working, quiet melodies her mother had hummed while kneading bread. The house seemed to absorb these sounds gratefully, as if it had been starving for music. Sometimes she caught herself humming tunes she didn't recognize, pulled from the walls themselves where happiness had once lived. The garden called to her most strongly. Rose bushes stood thorny and neglected, their strength turned inward for survival. Clara knew something about that particular kind of endurance. During her lunch break, she would walk among them, pulling weeds with the patience of someone who understood that healing happened one small gesture at a time. On a Thursday morning, she found the first rose blooming, a pale pink bud unfurling, like a shy smile. She left it untouched, but placed a glass of water beside it on the garden bench, a small offering to beauty's persistence. That evening, she heard the sheriff's boots pause at the garden gate. The rose was gone the next morning, but a single pink petal lay pressed between the pages of the romance novel on his desk. Clara smiled as she dusted around it, understanding this to be the beginning of a conversation they might never speak aloud. The photograph appeared on a Tuesday, face down on the kitchen counter, like a confession seeking absolution. Clara studied it without touching. A young woman with gentle eyes and hair the color of wheat in sunshine, standing beside a man Clara almost didn't recognize. This younger version of Sheriff Walker smiled with unguarded joy, his arm curved protectively around his wife's waist. Sarah, the inscription read in careful script. Our wedding day, June 15th, 1882. Clara left it undisturbed, but she noticed how carefully the sheriff positioned it each morning, not quite hidden, not quite displayed, as if he were testing his own capacity to look at happiness without flinching. She began to discover other artifacts of a life interrupted. A woman's hair ribbon in the study desk drawer, left open just enough for Clara to glimpse blue silk. A second set of reading, glasses on the bedroom nightstand she wasn't meant to access, visible through the cracked door. Wedding china displayed in the hutch, though only one place setting ever appeared on the dining table. The stories these objects told filled Clara with familiar ache. She'd left her own talismans behind, her father's pipe, still fragrant with cherry tobacco, her mother's wedding dress wrapped in tissue paper like a sleeping dream. Some losses required physical anchoring, lest they drift away entirely. On Friday, she found the sheriff's coffee cup unwashed in the sink, lipstick traces, faint around the rim like an echo of kisses. Clara washed it gently, understanding that he'd been trying to remember the taste of being loved. The house began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a place where grief lived alongside possibility. Clara cleaned around sorrow without, trying to polish it away, the way she'd learned to tend her father's sick room, acknowledging suffering while making space for small comforts. She started leaving tiny improvements in her wake, a vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table, curtains arranged to catch the most flattering light, books reorganized by some intuitive system that had nothing to do with alphabet and everything, to do with the heart's logic, the sheriff noticed. She could tell by the way he moved through spaces differently, touching surfaces she'd cleaned with something approaching reverence. Once she glimpsed him standing before the mantel photographs, his fingertips resting lightly on the frame edges, as if seeking permission to remember. Clara understood that healing required witnesses. Sometimes the bravest thing was simply staying present while someone else learned to breathe again. The morning Clara found the sheriff sitting at his kitchen table, instead of departing for his rounds. She froze in the doorway like a deer sensing danger. He looked up from his untouched coffee, and she saw exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. Begging your pardon, Sheriff, I can return later. Stay. The word emerged rough with disuse. Please. Clara set down her cleaning basket and moved to the stove, understanding without words that this was a morning for careful tending. She prepared fresh coffee with the deliberate quiet of someone who'd nursed the sleepless through long nights. I couldn't sleep, he said to the table. Dreams can be unkind, Clara replied, setting a cup before him. Steam rose between them like visible prayers. He studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. You speak like someone who knows. Clara poured her own cup and sat across from him, the first time she'd shared his table. My father passed last winter. Some nights I still set 2 plates for supper. They drank coffee in companionable silence, the morning light shifting across scarred wood between them. Clara noticed how his hands curved around the cup, seeking warmth or perhaps the simple comfort of holding something solid. Sarah made terrible coffee, he said suddenly, then looked surprised at his own words. But you drank it anyway. Every morning for 3 years. His smile held more sadness than joy. She'd get distracted reading while it brewed, always burned, always too strong. Love tastes different when someone makes it for you, Clara offered. He nodded, understanding, passing between them like current through still water. They finished their coffee without further words, but something had shifted in the space they shared, a wall lowered by just a few careful stones. When he finally rose to leave, the sheriff paused at the door. Thank you. For the coffee. For... He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at the house, at something beyond words. For staying. Clara finished. Yes. After he left, Clara noticed he'd forgotten his badge on the counter. The first time in 3 weeks she'd seen him without it. She polished it carefully and left it beside his evening place setting, understanding that some mornings required a person to remember who they were beyond their grief. The first whispers followed Clara like shadows. She heard them in the mercantile while purchasing cleaning supplies, saw them in the sideways glances of women gathering after Sunday service. Millbrook was small enough that everyone's business became community property, and a young unmarried woman spending hours in the widowed sheriff's house generated speculation like sparks from flint. "Seems awful convenient," Mrs. Abernathy observed, loudly enough for Clara to hear, how that girl arrived just as the sheriff needed domestic assistance. Clara kept her expression neutral, counting out coins for lye soap with steady hands. She'd faced gossip before, in her previous town, after her father's illness had consumed her savings and forced difficult choices. Women who'd never known desperation found it easy to judge those who had. Mrs. Henderson proved an unexpected ally. "Jealous biddies," she declared over supper at the boarding house. "Half the unmarried women in town have been trying to catch Ethan. Walker's attention since Sarah died. Course they're spiteful about someone actually succeeding." "I'm not trying to catch anything," Clara protested. "I'm simply working." "Honey, sometimes the best catching happens when you're not trying at all." The criticism sharpened when Clara began staying later, arriving earlier. She told herself it was practical. The house needed more attention as summer heat made dust settle heavier, made gardens require more frequent watering. But truthfully, she'd begun to crave those moments when the sheriff's guard lowered, when he shared fragments of memory over morning coffee or evening light. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon. Clara was tending the rose garden when Mrs. Abernathy appeared at the gate like a storm cloud seeking somewhere to rain. "Young woman, this town has standards." Clara continued deadheading spent. Blooms, her movements deliberately calm. "Yes, ma'am. A decent woman doesn't spend unsupervised time in a man's home. People talk. People often do." Clara straightened, meeting the older woman's disapproving gaze. "I'm employed to maintain this household. I perform my duties with integrity." "Integrity." Mrs. Abernathy's voice dripped skepticism. "We'll see how long that lasts when a grieving man's loneliness overcomes his judgment." The words hit Clara, like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed her own fears. What was she becoming in this house that breathed with another woman's presence? What comfort was she seeking in the careful space she and the sheriff had created between propriety and something deeper? That evening, she stayed late, polishing silver until it gleamed like captured starlight. When the sheriff returned, he found her still working, tears she hadn't realized she was crying falling onto the service she'd been buffing to brightness. "Clara." Her name in his voice sounded like concern wrapped in rough velvet. She wiped her eyes quickly, professionally. "Nearly finished, Sheriff." "What happened?" The kindness in his tone nearly undid her completely. She set down the serving spoon and faced him, seeing her own confusion reflected in his storm-grey eyes. "Perhaps Mrs. Abernathy is right," she whispered. "Perhaps I should find other employment." "Like hell." The violence in his voice surprised them both. He stepped closer, and Clara caught the scent of sage and saddle leather that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "What did she say to you?" "Nothing untrue. I am spending too much time here. People notice. They assume." "Let them." "Assume." His hands found her shoulders, warm and steady. "This house has been more alive these past weeks than in 2 years. You've given me back the ability to live within these walls instead of simply existing between them." Clara looked up, into his face, and saw something that made her breath catch. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. Fragile as new growth. "I don't know how to navigate this," she admitted. "Neither do I." His thumbs traced small circles against her shoulders. "But I know I sleep better in a house where someone sings while they work. I know morning coffee tastes like hope when shared. I know that for the first time since Sarah died, I can imagine tomorrow being different from today." They stood in the lamplight, surrounded by gleaming silver and the weight of unspoken possibilities. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, not the breaking open of heartbreak, but the careful unfurling of trust. "Stay," he said, and this time it sounded like a prayer. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by a boy too young to understand the weight of the envelope he carried. Clara recognized the careful script immediately, her Aunt Margaret's handwriting, precise as embroidery stitches, carrying news from the life she'd abandoned. She read it by the kitchen window while the sheriff worked in his study, the afternoon light making the paper translucent as onion skin. Dearest Clara, I hope this finds you well in your new circumstances. I write with news that may complicate your peace. Thomas Whitmore has been asking questions about your whereabouts. His interest seems persistent. I felt you should know. Your inheritance remains secure, though he continues to contest father's will. Mother's jewelry sits in my safe waiting for your return or instruction. Be careful, dear one. Some men mistake feminine kindness for obligation. With love and concern, Aunt Margaret. Clara's hands trembled as she folded the letter. Thomas Whitmore, her father's business partner, old enough to be her father himself, who'd interpreted her desperate acceptance of his financial help. During her father's illness as romantic encouragement, she'd fled east to escape his increasingly demanding courtship, leaving behind not just a town but an entire identity. Bad news? Clara startled. The sheriff stood in the doorway, concern etched across his features. She hadn't heard his approach, lost as she was in memories of whispered threats and unwanted hands seeking permission never granted. Family correspondence, she managed, tucking the letter into her apron pocket. He studied her face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading danger in others' expressions. You look like someone being hunted. The observation was so accurate that Clara laughed, though the sound held no humor. Perhaps I am. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something in his stillness invited confession. The sheriff moved closer, his movements careful as if approaching a wounded animal. What are you running from, Clara? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara looked up into his storm-grey eyes and saw understanding there, the recognition of someone who'd also fled from unbearable circumstances, though his escape had been internal while hers required actual miles. A man who believed his financial assistance purchased rights to my person, she said quietly, a town that agreed with him. The sheriff's jaw tightened, and Clara glimpsed the lawman beneath the gentle man who shared morning coffee with her. Is he still pursuing you? It appears so. Clara touched the letter through her apron fabric, though I pray distance and time will discourage his attentions. Men like that don't discourage easily. His voice carried the weight of professional experience. They view women as possessions to be reclaimed rather than people with agency. Clara nodded, remembering Thomas's fingers gripping her wrist with bruising insistence, his voice promising consequences if she continued to misunderstand his generosity. She'd understood perfectly, understood that kindness could become a cage if accepted from the wrong hands. I won't let anyone hurt you, the sheriff said, and the certainty in his voice made Clara's chest tighten with something between relief and terror. You barely know me, she whispered. I know enough. He stepped closer and Clara felt the warmth radiating from his body like heat from a well-tended fire. I know you sing while you work. I know you tend gardens like they're prayers. I know you've brought life back to a house that had forgotten how to breathe. His fingers found her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. I know that whatever you're running from, you're not running anymore. Clara felt tears gathering behind her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. In Thomas's pursuit, she'd been reduced to an object of desire and possession. In her aunt's concern, she remained the frightened girl who'd fled in the night. But in the sheriff's steady regard, she glimpsed the woman she might become, strong enough to stand her ground, worthy of protection freely offered rather than demanded. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For making me remember that not all men who offer help expect payment in pieces of my soul. His thumb traced the curve of her cheek, collecting a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Some of us offer help because it's the right thing to do, because seeing you safe makes the world feel more possible. Clara leaned into his touch, allowing herself this moment of comfort before the weight of decision pressed down again. Thomas Whitmore belonged to her past, but the sheriff was offering something that felt dangerously like a future. The sheriff, Ethan he'd finally asked her to call him, began sharing pieces of himself like a man learning generosity after years of hoarding. Over morning coffee he spoke of Sarah in careful, measured doses, as if testing his ability to hold joy and sorrow simultaneously. "She wanted children," he said one Thursday, watching steam rise from his cup. "We'd been trying for 2 years when she—" He paused, recalibrating. "When the shooting happened." Clara understood the weight of that particular loss, dreams that died alongside the dreamer. "I'm sorry." She would have been a wonderful mother, patient, kind. She sang lullabies to the neighbor's baby whenever Mrs. Patterson brought him. Biased Ethan's smile held more sweetness than pain now. Terrible voice like a crow with ambitions, but she sang anyway. "Love doesn't require perfect pitch," Clara offered. "No." He looked up, and Clara saw something new in his expression. Not the desperate clutching at memory, but the gentler hold of someone learning to carry loss without being crushed by it. "It doesn't." These conversations became the foundation for something Clara had never experienced before, a relationship built on mutual revelation rather than expectation. Ethan shared his fears about failing his town, about whether justice could ever truly balance the scales of loss. Clara spoke of her dreams to open a small bakery someday, of wanting to create sweetness for others, the way her mother had filled their kitchen with the warm scent of rising bread. "You could do that here," Ethan said one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching stars emerge like scattered promises across the darkening sky. "Could I?" Clara touched her locket, feeling the pressed violet's delicate outline. "Even with my complicated history? Especially because of it." Ethan's voice carried conviction. "This town needs people who understand that starting over isn't admitting defeat. It's choosing hope." The observation settled into Clara's chest like a seed finding fertile ground. She'd spent so long viewing her flight from Thomas as cowardice, but perhaps Ethan was right. Perhaps leaving required its own kind of courage. Their friendship deepened through small gestures that spoke louder than words. Ethan began leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table, not roses, which belonged to Sarah's memory, but prairie blooms that spoke of open sky and new growth. Clara started preparing small meals when his work kept him late, leaving covered plates warming on the stove, like edible prayers for his safe return. The town's whispers continued, but they began to change in tenor. Where once people saw scandal, some now noticed the way Ethan walked straighter, how his rare smiles came easier. Mrs. Henderson reported that several women had commented on the sheriff's improved appearance, not just his carefully pressed shirts and polished boots, but something less tangible, a lightness in his bearing, as if he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying too long. "Grief is like winter," Mrs. Henderson observed, watching Clara fold laundry in the boarding house's sunny kitchen. "Necessary for some kinds of growth, but it can't last forever without killing what it's supposed to protect." Clara considered this while pressing one of Ethan's shirts, running the iron over fabric that would rest against his skin. Was she helping him emerge from winter, or was she simply another form of escape? The question troubled her more than Mrs. Abernathy's disapproval ever had. The answer came on a Friday evening when Ethan returned to find Clara scrubbing blood from his kitchen floor. A prisoner's transport had gone badly. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to stain the careful order they'd built together, with reminders of the violence that shadowed his profession. "Clara, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." She continued scrubbing, her movements fierce with protective instinct. "This is what caring looks like. Cleaning up the mess so you can heal clean." Ethan knelt beside her, his hands covering hers on the scrub brush. "Look at me." Clara raised her eyes reluctantly, expecting to see pity or discomfort at her intensity. Instead, she found wonder. "Sarah used to clean my wounds," he said softly. but she never wanted to clean away the reasons I got wounded. She loved the man but feared the job. I'm not afraid of what you do, Clara realized as she spoke the words. I'm afraid of losing someone else who matters. That's the difference, Ethan said, lifting her hands to his lips to press gentle kisses against her knuckles. That's what makes this real. The kiss happened on a Sunday evening, soft as summer rain and just as inevitable. Clara had been arranging books in the study when Ethan appeared in the doorway, and something in his expression made her hands still on the leather spine she'd been straightening. "What is it?" she asked. "I've been thinking about tomorrow," he said, stepping into the room that smelled of leather and lingering pipe tobacco, "about how it might look different than today." Clara set down the book carefully, understanding that this moment balanced on the edge of change. Different how? With you in it, permanently. He moved closer and Clara felt her breath catch. Not as my housekeeper, as more. The word hung between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Clara searched his face for signs of the desperate man who'd clung to grief like a life raft, but found instead someone who'd learned to swim again. "Ethan!" She touched her locket, feeling the violet's familiar comfort. "I'm not Sarah. I don't want you to be." His hands framed her face, with the reverence reserved for precious things. "I want you to be Clara exactly as you are. Someone who sings while she works and tends gardens like their prayers. Someone brave enough to run toward a new life and strong enough to help another person find their way back to living." His thumbs traced her cheekbones, and Clara felt something unfurl in her chest. Not the desperate gratitude that had characterized her relationship with Thomas, but something steadier, deeper, like roots finding water. "Are you certain?" she whispered. "The town will talk. Your reputation—" "Let them talk." He smiled, and Clara glimpsed the man Sarah had fallen in love with, confident, gentle, sure of his own heart. "I've been dead for 2 years, Clara. You've taught me how to breathe again. How to want something beyond duty and remembrance." When their lips met, Clara tasted possibility flavored with patience. This wasn't the demanding kiss of possession she'd learned to fear, but something infinitely sweeter, the careful touch of someone who valued what he held. They stood in the lamplight, surrounded by books that held other people's stories, and wrote the beginning of their own. Clara felt the last of her resistance dissolve like sugar in warm tea, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize: hope. "I love you," Ethan said against her lips, the words carrying surprise at his own capacity for feeling. "I love you too," Clara whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They held each other as evening deepened outside the windows, learning the shape of this new country they'd discovered, the geography of 2 wounded hearts choosing to heal together rather than alone. The letter arrived on Tuesday, delivered by the same boy who'd brought Aunt Margaret's warning, but this time his expression held curiosity rather than innocence. Clara's name was written across the envelope in Thomas Whitmore's aggressive script, as if the very letters were trying to push their way through the paper. She opened it in the garden, among roses that had learned to bloom again under her careful tending. The afternoon sun made the paper seem to glow with malicious light. "My dear Clara, your game of hide-and-seek grows tiresome. I've traced your movements to Millbrook, and I find myself disappointed by your choice of companionship. A widowed sheriff, how dramatic. You will return to settle your father's affairs properly, as befits a woman of good breeding. I've been patient with your grief-induced hysteria, but my generosity has limits. Expect me within the week. We have much to discuss. Yours, in persistent affection, Thomas Whitmore." Clara's hands shook as she read the words again, hearing Thomas's voice in their calculated cruelty. Yours in persistent affection, as if stalking could be disguised with romantic language, as if his unwanted pursuit gained legitimacy through repetition. She found Ethan in his study, reviewing wanted posters with the methodical attention he brought to all official duties. When he looked up and saw her expression, His entire demeanor shifted from sheriff to protector. "He's coming," Clara said simply, holding out the letter. Ethan read it twice, his jaw tightening with each word. When he finished, his eyes held, the kind of cold fury that Clara imagined he reserved for the worst kind of criminals. "Over my dead body," he said quietly. "Ethan, you don't understand. Thomas has connections, influence. In my hometown, people believe his version of events, that I'm an ungrateful woman who accepted his help and then fled to avoid honoring my obligations." "What obligations?" The question came out sharp as broken glass. "He paid for my father's medical care, covered our debts when I couldn't work enough to manage both nursing and income." Clara sank into the chair across from his desk, feeling the weight of past decisions pressing down like storm clouds. "I accepted his help because I was desperate, but he acted as if it made me indebted in ways I never agreed to." Ethan came around the desk and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Clara, look at me. Accepting help doesn't create romantic obligation. Fear doesn't cancel consent, and no amount of money purchases the right to pursue someone who's made their disinterest clear." "Tell that to a town that thinks a woman alone should be grateful for any man's attention," Clara said bitterly. "Then we'll tell them together." Ethan's voice carried the kind of certainty that Clara had learned to trust. "As my wife." The words hung in the air like a bridge Clara wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. "Ethan, marry me," he said. And this time it sounded less like impulse and more like inevitability. "Not because of Thomas Whitmore or town gossip or anything, except the fact that I want to build a life with you. Want to wake up every morning knowing you're beside me, not just cleaning my house, but sharing it." Clara felt tears gathering, but they were complicated tears, joy and terror and something deeper that felt like coming home. "People will say you're rescuing me. People will say all kinds of things." Ethan's thumbs traced circles against her knuckles. "The only opinions that matter are ours. Do you want to marry me, Clara? Not as escape, but as choice." She looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not perfect, but real. Not without challenges, but facing them together. The scared girl who'd fled Thomas's pursuit was still part of her, but she was no longer the only part. "Yes," she whispered, and felt something settle into place inside her chest like a key finding its lock. Ethan pulled her from the chair and into his arms, spinning her around the study while law books looked on like benevolent witnesses. When he set her down, they were both laughing and crying simultaneously. "When?" Clara asked. "Soon," Ethan said, then paused, calculation replacing joy. "Before he arrives. Married women have legal protections that single women don't. And married to a sheriff." He smiled with predatory satisfaction. "Well, let's just say it might discourage his persistent affection." Clara felt a fierce surge of love for this man who thought not just with his heart but with his head, who understood that sometimes romance required strategy. She'd never had a protector before, only people who claimed protection while demanding payment. "I love you," she said, and meant it more completely than she ever had. "I love you too, Mrs. Walker-to-be." The title sent warmth through Clara's chest like sun breaking through clouds. Mrs. Walker. Not Clara, the desperate debtor, or Clara, the ungrateful woman, but Clara Walker, someone new, someone chosen, someone loved without conditions or obligations beyond the ones freely given. Pastor Mitchell's parlor smelled of beeswax candles and old books, creating an atmosphere that spoke of sacred promises made in sacred spaces. Clara sat beside Ethan on the horsehair sofa, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while Mrs. Henderson bustled about arranging the small ceremony with military efficiency. "It's not too late to have a proper wedding," the pastor offered gently, noting Clara's pale complexion. "The church would be honored to host—" "This is proper enough," Ethan interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that discouraged argument. "What matters is the commitment, not the ceremony." Clara squeezed his hand gratefully. A church wedding would mean public scrutiny, questions about her past, time they didn't have before Thomas arrived with his demands and accusations. This quiet ceremony felt more honest, two people choosing each other without fanfare or expectation. Mrs. Henderson had insisted on witnesses, recruiting the town doctor and his wife with the explanation that someone needed to ensure the sheriff wasn't making a grief-induced mistake. Dr. Patterson's wife had studied Clara with the sharp assessment of a woman who'd seen her share of human nature, then nodded approval. "You've got steady hands," she'd observed, "and kind eyes. That's what a lawman needs, someone who can clean wounds without flinching and offer comfort without judgment." Now, watching Pastor Mitchell arrange his ceremony notes, Clara felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a cloak. In less than an hour, she would be married. Not to escape Thomas's pursuit, though that provided welcome security, but because she'd found something rare and precious in this man who'd learned to love again despite the risk of loss. "Having second thoughts," Ethan murmured, noting her contemplative expression. "Third and fourth thoughts," Clara admitted, "but not about you, about whether I'm strong enough to be what you need." "You already are." His fingers found hers, warm and steady. "You've been what I need since the day you walked into my house and started singing while you worked." Pastor Mitchell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony was simple, stripped of elaborate language but heavy with meaning. Clara heard herself promising to love and honor, to stand beside Ethan through whatever storms might come. When he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, a simple band of gold that fit as if it had been waiting for her, she felt the last piece of her resistance dissolve. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Mitchell said with the satisfaction of a man who believed in the healing power of second chances. Ethan's kiss tasted like promises and possibility, like the completion of something that had been building between them since their first shared cup of coffee. Clara felt herself transform in that moment, not because marriage had changed her essential nature, but because she'd chosen to stop running and start building. The celebration afterward was small but warm. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a cake with suspicious efficiency, suggesting she'd been planning this outcome longer than anyone realized. Dr. Patterson offered a toast with medicinal whiskey, pronouncing them both improved by the association. As evening settled over Millbrook, Clara found herself standing in the garden of what was now genuinely her home, wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had declared suitable for both wedding and practicality. Ethan emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, and Clara smiled at the continuity of the gesture. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the garden bench. "Only that we waited so long," Clara said, and discovered she meant it. Completely. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge above the roses that had learned to bloom again. Clara touched her wedding ring with wonder, such a small circle of metal to represent such enormous change. "Thomas can arrive whenever he wants now," she said quietly. "I'm not running anymore." "No," Ethan agreed, his arms settling around her shoulders with possessive gentleness. "You're not running. You're home." Clara leaned into his warmth and felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. Home wasn't a place she'd been born to, or a situation she'd fled from. Home was this, the choice to stop, to plant roots, to trust that love could be shelter without becoming prison. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Thomas would arrive with his demands and accusations. The town would have opinions about their hasty marriage, and they would have to navigate the daily reality of building a life together. But tonight, surrounded by roses and starlight and the steady presence of a man who loved her without conditions, Clara Walker felt ready for whatever came next. Thomas Whitmore arrived on Thursday's noon train like a storm cloud in expensive clothing. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he emerged onto the platform, his gaze surveying Millbrook with the distaste of a man accustomed to more impressive accommodations. Even at a distance, she could read the aggressive set of his shoulders, the proprietary way he examined his surroundings. "He's here," she called to Ethan, who was cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table with the methodical attention he brought to all preparations. Ethan rose and moved to the window, studying the man who'd driven his wife to flee across 3 states. Thomas Whitmore was exactly what Clara had described, well-dressed, well-fed, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything he truly wanted. "He looks like trouble wrapped in respectability," Ethan observed. "That's exactly what he is." Clara touched her wedding ring for courage, drawing strength from its unfamiliar weight. He'll go to the boarding house first. Try to establish his version of events before approaching us directly. Let him. Ethan's voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd spent years facing down dangerous situations. This is my town. Clara? And you're my wife. That means something here. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Thomas appeared at their front door before supper, his face flushed with either heat or anger. Clara answered his knock with Ethan's presence solid and reassuring behind her. Clara. Thomas's voice held the forced warmth of a man trying to disguise fury as concern. You've led me quite a chase, my dear. Mr. Whitmore. Clara kept her tone level, professional. I wasn't aware you were traveling to Millbrook. Weren't you? His eyes moved past her to catalogue Ethan's presence. And this would be the sheriff I've heard so much about, Thomas Whitmore. He extended his hand with calculated friendliness. Ethan ignored the gesture. Sheriff Walker. And you're trespassing. On private property. The social slight hit Thomas like a physical blow, his practiced charm flickering momentarily. I've come to escort Clara home. There are matters to settle regarding her father's estate. Mrs. Walker's business affairs will be handled through proper legal channels, Ethan said, and Clara felt a surge of fierce love at hearing her new name spoken with such certainty. Mrs. Walker? Thomas's mask slipped entirely, revealing the entitled rage beneath. Clara, surely you haven't been so foolish as to marry a good man who loves me? Clara stepped forward, her fear transforming into something sharper. Thomas, I was never yours to claim. Your assistance during my father's illness was appreciated, but created no obligation beyond gratitude. Gratitude? Thomas's laugh held no humor. Is that what you call accepting money for your father's care, allowing me to pay your debts, leading me to believe... Leading you to believe what? Clara's voice rose, months of suppressed anger finally finding voice. I never encouraged your attentions. I made my discomfort clear repeatedly. You chose to interpret basic human decency as romantic interest. Thomas's face darkened. A woman alone has responsibilities, Clara. Obligations to those who... The lady has made her position clear, Ethan interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his gun. As has the law. Harassment of a married woman carries serious consequences. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a powder keg. Thomas looked between them, calculating odds with the desperation of a gambler facing an empty pocket. Clara saw the moment he realized his power had evaporated, that whatever influence he'd wielded in their hometown meant nothing here, in this place where she was protected by law and love. This isn't over, Thomas said finally, directing his words to Clara with the venom of a man unaccustomed to losing. There are debts to be settled, obligations to honor. The only obligation Mrs. Walker has, Ethan said quietly, is to live her life free from unwanted pursuit. I suggest you remember that. Thomas turned on his heel and stalked away, but not before Clara caught the promise of retribution in his backward glance. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing with the aftermath of confrontation. Is it over? She asked. Ethan gathered her into his arms, his chin resting atop her head. He'll try other approaches, legal, challenges social pressure, maybe hiring someone to investigate our marriage. But Clara, listen to me. He pulled back to meet her eyes. You're not alone anymore. Whatever he tries, we'll face it together. Clara felt tears of relief and residual fear slip down her cheeks. For so long, Thomas's pursuit had felt inevitable, a debt that could never be fully paid, a trap from which there was no clean escape. But standing in her own kitchen, surrounded by the life she'd chosen, she finally understood what Ethan had been trying to tell her. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing her ground. October arrived with the whisper of change in cooling air and shifting light. Clara stood in her garden, harvesting the last of the roses before frost could claim them, and marveled at how much had transformed since her arrival in spring. The garden bloomed with confident abundance now, no longer tentative in its beauty. Like herself, it had learned to trust its own growth. Thomas had departed 2 weeks earlier, his threats proving as hollow as his charm. Word came through Aunt Margaret that he'd found a more compliant widow to court, someone whose gratitude came without the inconvenience of an independent will. Clara felt only relief at the news, like a weight she'd forgotten she was carrying finally lifted from her shoulders. The townspeople had gradually accepted her marriage, helped considerably by Mrs. Henderson's strategic campaign of information and Dr. Patterson's wife's wholehearted endorsement. Mrs. Abernathy still pursed her lips in disapproval, but she couldn't argue with visible results. Sheriff Walker smiled more, stood straighter and handled difficult situations with renewed patience. "The garden looks like happiness," Ethan observed, emerging from the house with their afternoon coffee. 3 months of marriage had given him an ease Clara treasured, the comfortable intimacy of someone who no longer questioned his right to contentment. "It feels like happiness," Clara agreed, accepting her cup and settling beside him on the bench they'd positioned to catch the best light. "I never expected to love something I planted myself more than the flowers in my mother's garden." "Different kind of beauty," Ethan said, understanding as always, "the kind you choose instead of inherit." They sat in comfortable silence, watching autumn paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Clara felt the seasons' changes like a symphony in her bones, not endings, but transitions. The garden would sleep through winter and wake transformed in spring, carrying the memory of this year's growth into whatever came next. "I've been thinking," Clara said, her fingers playing with the locket at her throat, "about opening that bakery we discussed." Ethan's eyebrows rose with interest. "In town?" "The Riverside building has been empty since the hat shop closed. Good space, proper windows, close enough to the train station for travelers." Clara had been observing the property for weeks, imagining the smell of fresh bread drifting onto Main Street. "I have some money saved, and Mrs. Henderson thinks the town would welcome a proper bakery. What would you call it?" Clara smiled, the name arriving fully formed as if it had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "The Violet Rose. For the pressed flower in this locket, something I carried from my old life, and for the roses here, something that learned to bloom again." Ethan set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "Clara Walker, you continue to amaze me. Because I want to open a bakery? Because you've transformed fear into purpose? Because you're choosing to plant roots instead of just hiding from storms?" He reached up to trace the line of her cheek with gentle fingers. "Because you've taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means carrying love forward instead of being trapped by loss." Clara leaned into his touch, feeling the truth of his words settle into her heart like seeds finding fertile ground. She'd spent so many years defined by what she was running from that she'd forgotten the power of running towards something. "Sarah would have liked you," Ethan said quietly, the comment carrying no weight of comparison, only the simple gift of inclusion. "She would have appreciated how you've helped me remember that loving someone new doesn't diminish what came before." Clara felt tears gather, but they were gentle tears, the kind that came from gratitude rather than grief. "I hope so. I hope she would have been happy that you found your way back to living." "She would have been." Ethan's voice carried quiet certainty. "Sarah believed in love that multiplies rather than divides. She would have seen you as proof that the heart can be broken and healed and still have room for more." They held each other as evening settled over their garden, two people who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to build something beautiful despite it. Clara felt her future spreading before her like dawn light, not without challenges, but bright with possibility. The Violet Rose Bakery would serve more than bread and pastries. It would offer the same thing Clara had found in this house, this marriage, this carefully tended garden. The radical act of choosing hope over fear, growth over safety, love over the certainty of solitude. In the distance, the train whistle announced another arrival to Millbrook, someone else perhaps seeking a new beginning in this place where wounded hearts could learn to heal. Clara smiled and squeezed Ethan's hand, ready to welcome whatever tomorrow might bring. Spring returned with eager abundance, and Clara stood before the window of her bakery as sunrise painted Main Street in shades of gold and promise. The Violet Rose had opened 3 months earlier, to lines of curious townspeople. and the warm approval of travelers who declared her cinnamon rolls the finest between St. Louis and Denver. Behind her, bread rose in neat rows while coffee percolated in the pot. She'd learned to brew strong enough to satisfy even Ethan's standards. The morning ritual of baking had become her prayer. Flour and water and yeast transformed through patience into something that nourished both body and spirit. The bell above the door chimed, and Clara turned to find a young woman hovering uncertainly on the threshold. She was perhaps 19, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd traveled farther than miles could measure. "Are you open?" the poor girl asked, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone accustomed to rejection. "Always," Clara said warmly, recognizing something familiar in the stranger's guarded posture. "Coffee's fresh, and the cinnamon rolls are just out of the oven." The girl's eyes brightened at the mention of food, and Clara saw hunger there, not just for sustenance but for kindness freely given. She prepared a plate with generous portions and set it before the girl along with coffee lightened with real cream. "How much do I owe you?" the girl asked, reaching for a worn purse with hands that trembled slightly. "Nothing," Clara said, refilling the coffee cup before it was empty. "Every traveler deserves one free meal in a new place. It's good luck for both of us." The girl stared at her with the bewilderment of someone unaccustomed to generosity without strings. "I don't understand." "Someone once told me that accepting help doesn't create obligation," Clara explained gently. "Sometimes people offer kindness because it's the right thing to do, not because they expect payment." Understanding flickered in the girl's eyes, followed by something that looked suspiciously like tears. She ate with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste food, but Clara caught her glancing around the bakery with appreciation for its warm yellow walls and curtains that let in cheerful light. "You're not from here," the girl observed. "No. I came on the train last year carrying a carpet bag and more hope than sense." Clara settled into the chair across from her guest, understanding that sometimes feeding people required more than food. "Left behind some things that weren't worth keeping. Found some things I didn't know I was looking for." "What kind of things?" Clara touched her wedding ring, then gestured toward the window where Ethan could be seen making his morning rounds, his stride confident and unhurried. "Purpose, partnership, the kind of peace that comes from choosing your own life instead of accepting what others think you deserve." The girl followed her gaze and smiled at whatever she saw in Clara's expression. "He loves you. He does, and I love him. But more than that, we've chosen to build something together. This bakery, our life, the kind of home where strangers can find a safe meal and honest conversation." They sat in comfortable silence while the girl finished her breakfast, and Clara felt the familiar satisfaction of providing comfort. The Violet Rose had become more than a business. It served as an unofficial sanctuary for travelers seeking fresh starts, women fleeing unwanted circumstances, anyone brave enough to choose change over certainty. "I'm looking for work," the girl said finally. "Anything honest. I can clean, cook, tend children or gardens." Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house mentioned needing kitchen help, Clara offered, and the pastor's wife could use assistance with the Sunday school. Both are good people who judge by character rather than circumstance. The girl's relief was visible. "Thank you, This is the first place I've felt welcome in weeks." "Everyone deserves welcome," Clara said simply. "Everyone deserves a chance to become who they're meant to be." The bell chimed again, and Dr. Patterson entered with his usual morning urgency, seeking coffee strong enough to fuel his busy day. As Clara prepared his order, she listened to him chatting with the girl about her journey, offering practical advice about lodging and employment with the casual kindness she'd come to expect from Millbrook's better residents. By mid-morning, the girl, Emma, she'd finally revealed, had been hired at the boarding house and directed to a clean room at fair rent. Clara watched her walk down Main Street with straighter shoulders and lifted chin, carrying herself like someone who'd remembered her own worth. Ethan appeared at lunch, settling into what had become his regular seat with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his place in the world. "I hear you've been collecting strays again," he said with fond amusement. "Just offering what was offered to me," Clara replied, serving him soup and fresh bread still warm from the oven. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is prove that kindness exists without conditions. Is that what you think I did? Offered you unconditional kindness? Clara considered the question as she filled his coffee cup. You offered me the chance to earn kindness, to prove I was worthy of it through my own actions, rather than accepting it as charity or owing it as debt. That might be even more valuable. Ethan reached across the table to capture her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding ring that had become as natural as her own heartbeat. I offered you what every person deserves, the right to be seen for who you truly are, rather than what circumstances have made you appear to be. Clara felt the familiar warmth that came from being understood so completely. A year ago, she'd been a frightened woman fleeing unwanted pursuit, carrying nothing but pressed flowers and desperate hope. Now she was a baker, a wife, a woman, who'd learned to transform her own healing into nourishment for others. Do you think she'll make it? Clara asked, watching Emma through the window as she helped Mrs. Henderson carry groceries. Our latest stray? If she's anything like the woman who opened this bakery, Ethan said, she'll do more than make it. She'll bloom. Clara smiled and squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of possibility flowing between them like current through still water. Outside, spring painted the world in shades of green and gold, promising growth to anyone brave enough to plant seeds in uncertain ground. The violet rose continued its quiet work of providing sustenance and sanctuary, one cup of coffee and one act of kindness at a time. And Clara Walker, no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid to claim her own worth, continued the work of transforming wounds into wisdom, fear into flower, and the simple act of choosing love into something that nourished everyone it touched. In the distance, the train whistle announced another arrival, another soul seeking something better than what they'd left behind. Clara smiled and began preparing fresh coffee, ready to offer welcome to whoever might need it, understanding finally that home wasn't a place you found but a choice you made, over and over again, with every act of courage, every gesture of grace, every decision to stop running and start building instead.